Well, thank you so much for answering my questions. We will now like to invite questions from the audience. If you'd like to raise your hand, I'll call on you as I see you. Yes.
Well, thank you, Jon, for...
Saleh.
Have we got another microphone? Or
we do, but I hope I can hear.
We can hear it.
We can hear.
Okay.
Well, thank you. The last section is quite good. It reminds me, this is a small comment, when the father of Rumi, Mevlana Celal Rumi, before he died, the Sultan of the Seljuk asked him, "You are the Sultan of the heart, and I'm the Sultan of the, the state. What will happen to both of us when we die?" He said that when you die, your sultanate will end. But when I close my eyes, then my sultanate will begin.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Saleh.
So my question is, what do you see in the next 10 years of Hizmet?
Oh, well, I have a beautiful out here in that I am a historian, and so historians look back rather than looking forward. But brief answer would be, every time Mr. Gulen has faced opposition, every time power has sought to oppress him and to shut down Hizmet, and it has happened repeatedly, Hizmet has returned, has grown stronger through Mushbat Harakat, positive action, not reacting to the evil, but creatively continuing to apply in new ways Hizmet. For example, when Mr. Gulen was on the move for 6 years, he was persona non grata in a weird kind of political theater in Turkey, where the police would show up and he would have to leave his apartment on the 5th floor in Altunizada and flee to Erzurum to a safe house, or flee to Izmir to a safe house. What emerged out of that 6 years on the run was a network of people who learned to trust each other. So what the government thought it was doing by oppressing Hizmet actually turned out to be to the advantage of Hizmet in moving the movement beyond one particular individual and his charismatic preaching into a grassroots organic movement of people who had learned to trust each other throughout Turkey. So that's just one example, and again, I don't have a crystal ball. The one rule of history is it's contingent, it depends. I mean, it can happen, it can change in a moment. But if previous patterns repeat themselves, the current oppression will mean the next 10 years could be the best years for Hizmet.
Thanks for your talk. I haven't read your book, and I look forward to reading it very much.
And it's Peter?
Peter Riddell from Melbourne School of Theology, yes. I spend quite a bit of time, and there's no doubt you do, supervising PhD theses. And of course, one thing one looks for in PhD theses is that critical edge. Now, we've only had a very small snapshot tonight of your book, but what I heard sounded very hagiographic. So throwing that one in your direction, where's the critical edge? Did you engage with other works that reach different conclusions and so forth?
I did, and I wanted to intentionally avoid hagiography by consistently contextualizing Hizmet and Hoca Efendi's life in the context of Turkey. I talked to anyone and everyone and studied the evidence, and my book is based insofar as possible on a close reading in the best University of Chicago critical studies approach to the evidence and sifting close reading of Mr. Gulen's writings through a series of interviews with people close to him, and reading the Alexander legal reports, reading the Turkish government's documents, reading people like Danny Roderick and Mustafa Akyol, and speaking with them, interviewing them, talking with them as well. The interpretive principle that I followed, while having my own critiques and plenty of critical comments that I could make publicly about the movement, one of the things that was most important to me, for instance, just by way of example, was to include women's voices. Very importantly in the book, which was actually a little difficult to do because of the somewhat patriarchal character of Turkish culture historically. But my interpretive approach was guided actually by a maxim of Martin Luther, again, who in his interpretation of the Eighth Commandment said, which, the Eighth Commandment reads, "Thou shalt not bear false witness," said that our purpose in understanding another, and I come to this movement from the outside, as someone who is not a Muslim, who is not really even a scholar of Islam, and am not a person of Hizmet, other than that I see very much a compatibility between my own work for justice and organizing and what is happening within Hizmet. But the principle was put the best construction on everything. This is what Luther said. So my approach was always to contextualize the critiques and to try to incorporate those positive aspects and to encourage those positive aspects within Hizmet that would address issues such as gender equality, that address issues such as transparency and somewhat opaque accountability structures that emerged within Turkey, and similar dynamics that we could talk about privately. Thank you, Peter. Hank.
Yeah, maybe I should first read the book and then ask my question.
Always a good idea. But you heard my talk.
But yeah, so there are maybe two questions. When there is that historically the colonialism, there's one thing that colonialism left in the Middle East is the nation state, which made Turkey now a totally different state from what it was.
Yes.
And in that regard, the question of the attitude of Fethullah Gulen to the Kurds and Kurdistan in Turkey.
So that's one question. Is there another?
One question.
Okay, I can speak to that.
The other one, I have to say, I have read the book by Sali yourself, and so that is one of my sources. I have some books by Gulen himself, but also Wikipedia. And
It's not as bad as you think. It's actually pretty good.
But if that is so, then maybe there is time to actually correct that.
On Mr. Gulen, the Wikipedia article on Mr. Gulen, yeah, somebody work on that, okay? Please. I mean, it's open source, so the Turkish government has lots of bots working on, creating a...
Because, especially the attitude to the Kurds, for instance, but there's another thing, and that is, I'm preparing myself a book on the Golden Rule, and in practice, Christian or interfaith, and in the Golden Rule, maybe now in public life, demands that there is a separation between politics, religion,
Yes.
culture,
Yes.
and economics. And I read in Wikipedia that the ISMAT and the schools are financed by the businesses by a sort of tax.
By a sort of tax?
A tax, yeah, that they are taxed.
No.
No, well, okay.
Okay.
So you see what it is?
Yeah.
So you have Wikipedia. And
Correct
you
it. Improve it.
And mostly it is actually quite reliable.
All right, so thank you, Hank. If I could, two questions about the nation state and Mr. Gulen's attitude towards the Kurds, and the second is a question about the financing within Hizmet. Thank you. Both those are excellent questions. Actually, in regard to the Turkish nation state, I think we can see, honestly, a fair amount of evolution in Mr. Gulen's thinking, and that which is not surprising for someone who grew up in a small parochial village, Korajuk, which was a place that was besieged by the Russians. And so there was a strong sense of national identity, even though that nation state also oppressed Muslims, right, and tried to privatize the faith in some ways. So Mr. Gulen early especially was favorable, and some statements in his writings could be perceived as reinforcing a sense of Turkish nationalism even, and that he's been so accused. But I think as his perspective expanded, as he moved from Korajuk to Edirne, to Izmir, this amazing cosmopolitan city, beautiful. Anybody from Izmir? Yeah, it's just a lovely place. All right, and you know what he said about Izmir when he was appointed there? He said, "I will drown there," right? Because he's this village boy in this incredibly cosmopolitan leftist place. But then from Izmir to Istanbul, his horizon expanded. He's a human being. He learns from his experiences. And increasingly, that nationalism drops away and his perspective becomes far more global and cosmopolitan, we might say. So that's a short answer to your question. There's been an evolution, I think. Second, in relationship to the Kurds, Mr. Gulen also, I think it's fair to say, has been pretty consistently an advocate for Kurdish participation in Turkish society. In contrast, I mean, he's done so carefully, but in contrast to the scapegoating of the Kurds and the violence that has gone back and forth through the civil war and through the conflicts. I mean, he's been an advocate for nonviolence, and promoting the building of schools in some of the conflict-torn regions, and trying to then engage people on both sides who might have been inclined to perpetuate in that demonism or demonizing of the other, that us-them dualism in learning especially, and in dialogue and in peace building. Second question about the funding of the movement. Is there a tax on Hizmet people to support the schools? How many of you have been taxed to support the Hizmet schools? Let me raise your hands if you have received a tax bill from the Hizmet Corporation to support the schools. No, these are voluntary contributions in the same way that Christians are invited to tithe, right? 10%. Most Christians manage maybe 1 or 2, whereas some people within Hizmet will give 30%, 35%, out of devotion. So in a practice of devotion, well above and beyond the practice, the mandated practice of zakat, charity, and rather participating in himet for Hizmet is how I put it in the book. But they're voluntary contributions, not some kind of coercive practice.
Is there social pressure within Hizmet to be give at that level?
If only there were more social pressure among Christians to be charitable in the same fashion. And I say this now as someone who's serving a congregation where, Philip and I were talking. We have a nice congregation here. Perhaps we should take up an offering or have a raffle or something tonight. We won't. Don't worry, okay? No social pressure this evening. Of course. I mean, this is how human beings operate, right? Is that we can learn through positive mimesis and positive example to be more charitable than we might be inclined to be. And in that sense, yes, of course. I mean, and I don't think that's anything surprising or anything that necessarily is a problem. In fact, it's again, a dynamic in many ways to be admired, that people encourage one another, push one another to participate more robustly.
There is, to my mind, a Christian equivalent, but it's rather ugly, and I'm thinking there of the prosperity gospel. And I'm certainly not trying to compare the two And of course, in the case of the prosperity gospel, the idea is that you give so that you will be blessed.
Yeah,
which
right.
is quite a different idea. But we'll move on.
Okay.
Any questions from the right-hand side, or my right-hand side? Please.
Hello, good evening. I'm from Selenium Foundation. When I was looking for a movement in my late teens, in younger age, I saw lots of groups come and go and so on and so forth. But one of the things that impressed me most with Islamic movement before I joined is they said you be you, we be us, and there is things that we can work together on. So I see this happening through dialogue with my Christian friends.
Sure.
We're sort of learning about each other and growing together and getting closer. And we're realising there's things we can work together on.
Absolutely.
Do you see that cooperation growing?
Very much so. I can't remember who I was speaking with earlier today, and I said, you know, there are times I despair of interfaith work because often at interfaith gatherings, there are people of a certain vintage and era, you know, wearing Birkenstocks and, you know, representing a sort of certain mentality, right? And yet, I think young people get it, recognize the imperative for interfaith work and dialogue, and actually, in many cases, rebel against the sort of institutional silos of Hindu, Buddhist, Christian, Muslim, and realize the capacity we have when we work together for peace. And as a historian, I can recognize that this experiment in interreligious engagement and dialogue and peace building is barely a century old. So it's still really quite in its infancy in the way that Hoja Effendi talks about technology and science too. This is very much true of interreligious and interfaith work. And we're fortunate that there is a science of peace building that's beginning to emerge. There are centers focused on interreligious engagement, not just within Hizmet, but emerging from many different sources around the globe. And I definitely see the Hizmet, people of Hizmet, people inspired by Fethullah Gülen and Hoja Effendi, among those folks working towards peace as a way of interreligious cooperation. It doesn't mean, you know, reducing your faith to some kind of least common denominator, but it means, okay, we're different. We're very different. We have different beliefs, but yet here are some problems we have as people that we need to work on together. None more crucial facing us all right now than the climate crisis, right? And it seems to me that is the issue par excellence, that we need cooperation. We need all hands on deck across religious communities, across the scientific and technological community, addressing together what we have done to this one beautiful earth that our Creator has given us.
Time for one more.
Zeki I'm from Swiss College. So you mentioned different aspects of the altruism. So the person came to my mind. It's a very international figure of Hizmet, as a Hizmet person, is MS contact. So we mentioned altruism, and then he's organizing maybe right about maybe 45 different states, maybe 45 different cities, and organizing free camps for kids.
Yeah.
So it's not a question actually, but one is kind of his teaching is getting him to do all these kind of activities and being a role model in a society. So how do you comment to that? I mean, what's the reaction from the American society to those camps? It's usually famous NBA player is organizing these things for free and even giving free pizza.
It's a beautiful thing. Food unites us, right? Across cultures. Thanks be to God for that. You know, I'm not sure it has really dawned on most Americans yet why Enes Kanter is doing these things. I'm not sure they've made the connection yet to Mr. Gülen and to Hoja Effendi. But my hope is that they will. And my hope, I mean, this is one of the things sport can do, right? Is it can give us a platform, a foundation to unite people in a way that can help us to learn more about each other around play, around the beauty and joy of human beings, testing their abilities to the utmost, whether it's in Aussie rules football. I hear the playoffs are coming up. Is that correct?
I hope you did go to Green Bay, by the way.
Thank you. Yes, the Packers play the Bears, yes, in the opening game next week. But, sport truly is one of those ways that we can transcend our cultural differences because the game is the same no matter where it is played, right? Music is another one of those ways that we can experience flow and transcend our cultural differences. As well, I recognize music within Islam is somewhat differently understood than within Christianity, but nevertheless, I say in the book that as I understand it, the truth of Quran, the truth of the Holy Quran is like the truth of music, right? It's not a literal correspondence between word and fact or event. But there's a different kind of truth operative, and that's true across our religious and spiritual traditions. And so in that sense, the truth of our traditions is found in the truth of, sport, too.
Well, I don't want to cast a dampener on that, but my experience with sport is that it's incredibly disappointing.
Depends on your loyalties.
I play table tennis 4 times a week, and I have an intensely competitive spirit, but no ability whatsoever. That being so, thank you very much for your openness and your time tonight, Jon.
Barney, it's great to be here. Thank you for your questions as well.